Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center webinar series, sponsored by the Administration for Community Living and hosted by the American Society on Aging. We'll get started in just a moment, but a few notes before we do that. The slides for today's presentation are available under the tab on your screen that's labeled Resources. Under the tab labeled CE Application here, that's where you'll find information on how to obtain continuing education credit for this event. And you'll have 60 days to complete a continuing education application. It'll take up to 30 days from the date of your application for us to process and issue your CE credit. If you're not logged in directly to this webinar, that is, if you're watching as part of a group and did not log in using an individual confirmation URL, you will not be eligible for continuing education credit because we have no way to track your online attendance. If you'd like to receive continuing education credit, be sure you log in using a confirmation URL that you received after individually registering for this webinar. If you have questions during the presentation, you can send those at any time using the questions box, and we will hold the last 10 to 15 minutes of today's program to answer those questions. So with that, I'd like to welcome today's moderator, Shay Schumann, with the National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center. Shay?
Thank you so much, Leanne, and thank you to all our participants for joining us today for the National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center webinar, Building and Maintaining Relationships After a Dementia Diagnosis. The National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center webinar series is supported by the Administration for Community Living. Before we start the presentations, Erin Long of the Administration for Community Living will provide us with a brief welcome. Erin?
Hi everyone. I just want to say a quick thank you to everyone for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today for this very important topic. And I want to thank Matthew Estrade and Shay Edwards for sharing their wisdom with us. So without further ado, back to you, Sari.
Thanks so much. So it's my pleasure to introduce our presenters today. Matthew Estrade was inspired to join the field of dementia after seeing his mother be the solo caregiver to his grandfather in the late 1990s. He is the project manager at the Oxnard Health Site of the Louisiana Geriatric Workforce Enhancement Program, a HRSA grant held by the Louisiana State University. Matthew graduated with a master's in gerontology from the University of Louisiana at Monroe and has been a caregiver support group facilitator for 6 years. He is a podcaster, blogger, and author of the Peace with Dementia Rosary Education Intentions Community. We also have with us today Shay Edwards, who became her mother's full-time solo care partner 6 years ago at the age of 29. 2 years ago, she enrolled herself and her mother in a caregiver study, telling the EcoCare team that she wanted to do whatever was possible to make a better world for caregivers and people living with dementia. Today, Ms. Edwards presents as a caregiver speaker on dementia panels geared toward healthcare and social work professionals and appreciates the enormous agency she has in speaking for caregivers like her. She also works with her local community to create or find resources, opportunities, networks, and infrastructure for those living with dementia and their care partners. Ms. Edwards has the unique position of being both a caregiver and someone who is conducting advocacy, community work, and research regarding caregivers for people living with dementia. At this time, I will turn the floor over to Matt Estrade to begin his presentation, and then he will we'll move on to Shay Edwards after that. Matt?
Thank you, Sari. It is such a pleasure to be here with everyone here today. You can see the 4 objectives on the screen, but it really boils down to understanding some of the social dynamics that impact care partners, and most importantly, how we as professionals can empower persons living with dementia and their care partners with tips and tools to create change in their networks. The road to all of us being here on this webinar began when Joseph, a care partner in my Tuesday support group, simply stated that friends dry up. In an instant, everybody around the table understood volumes about those 3 words. This is simply when friends and family stop coming around, or less often because of the symptoms of dementia that are present, even if there is not a probable diagnosis. That night, we came up with a list of reasons, not excuses, for why this may happen. And you can see that list here on the slide. I'll expand on ambiguous loss in a few minutes. This experience of friends drying up is a tragic and a common consequence of dementia that Anna, Shay, and I are privileged to shed a light on. It's really an opportunity for growth for us as providers and practitioners in the many disciplines here, as well as an opportunity for the care partners of those living with dementia, those who are living with dementia, and those who have dried up and have gone away. We challenge them to be more participative. Here are some brief action steps when collaborating with your patients, clients, and families that you deal with every day. First is ask families about what their emotional network looks like today. You might ask a question that sounds like this. Do you have the same number of friends and family that you did before the symptoms had showed an onset? And then briefly wait for an answer as it kind of sinks in, because many times they've not realized this. Number two, offer communication tips. And one example of this is to suggest that families create boundaries and ideas for interacting with the loved one who has dementia. That can be topics of conversation, best times of the day to visit, activities that are more suitable now because the person is living with dementia. Now, these things are going to build confidence in those family and friends who are probably still very reluctant about coming by. And that's what we want to do. We want to help empower the families, but they're going to then go empower these people to visit more often. Encourage caregivers to reach out. But understand that some of these families that you're working with, they might have too much pride, and they might not feel like reaching out to those who have dried up. And that's perfectly normal, but I think it's still good to introduce that idea and plant the seed and just kind of see where it goes from there. And then finally, to print or email information on local and online support groups. So in addition to Joseph and countless dementia care partners sounding the alarm on this topic, the science concurs. The treatment group of the dementia caregivers of Dr. Drentia's 2006 study became, quote, better at fostering emotional ties that they needed and better at socializing more. This explained in part why they had better support satisfaction. Another quote from that study, what really matters is having a close circle of people who can be called upon for the emotional support. Moreover, having socially supportive contacts to their homes to visit helps these caregivers stay connected and feel less isolated. And then there's Dr. Zaret's 1980 landmark publication on burden that revealed in it, subjects receiving more visits from grandchildren, from children, and siblings had caregivers who reported less burden. Many years ago, a different dementia caregiver told me that she was benefiting from the support group that we were facilitating, but she felt that she might be needing a bereavement group as well because she was grieving the loss of her mother who was still alive. So when I learned about this concept of ambiguous loss on a podcast from the Iowa Geriatric Education Center describing the concept, those two slides hit me like a ton of bricks. It felt like what she was describing in that situation, and I knew that I had found the topic of my master's thesis. So Dr. Pauline Boss, who's at the University of Minnesota, she wrote about this concept in 1977 as her dissertation, and for the past 45 years has continued to pioneer this concept. Ambiguous loss is an unclear loss as opposed to a clear loss when someone dies, where there's a funeral and the grieving is very obvious. Now, we're going to focus on one, but there are two types of ambiguous loss. The first one is where the person is living. That's the person with dementia that's living and they're physically present, but they're psychologically absent or different. And that's going to be, of course, our focus for today. Now, to complete this concept of ambiguous loss, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the second type. And this is when the person is physically absent, but always on the mind of the family member. So some examples might be the family of a military member who is missing in action, the family of a parent who walks away from that family, or a family member who is missing after the 9/11 attacks. In fact, this was the type of ambiguous loss that Dr. Boss first wrote about back in the 70s when she was studying the wives of Navy pilots of those who are missing from Vietnam. But remember, today we're talking about the first type. That's where the person is physically present but psychologically absent. And this is in relation to our dementia care partners. Dementia presents many losses, with each person being unique. Some of these include a loss of, for the person with dementia, this is a loss of feeding oneself, bathing oneself, driving, and making important decisions. On the care partner side, there could be losses such as shared decision-making, conversations, and even inside jokes. And these losses, these small losses, they add up, and they're usually only recognized by the dementia care partner who is there more often and taking care of them. To paraphrase Dr. Boss, the public recognition is only when there are cards, flowers, and a funeral after the person living with dementia has passed away. Ambiguous loss may cause a care partner to freeze to a point where they're not proactive. So care partners, the same that we encourage to take care of their own health, to seek advance directives, and to socialize with family and friends, may feel immobilized to do these things that make sense even to them. It may also cause someone to question who is in the family and also keep others at an emotional distance. And the way that I've seen this in support groups and meeting with client families is the son who says, you know, my dad no longer recognizes me, so is he still my dad? Or he may also, in that same conversation, say, why should I visit my dad if he doesn't remember me? So that's an example of that emotional distance that they're creating in order to cope with this. And it's, of course, not a proper way of coping with it. In my master's thesis project, I observed that care partners who received ambiguous loss education in the form of Dr. Boss's book and other modules that I had offered in there had a sense of relief just knowing that this was a common feeling, that there was a name for it. And I really wish I could go back and talk to that care partner who gave me the idea to let them know, yes, this is something, this is real. So that being said, it's crucial that all of us on the call are aware of this concept of ambiguous loss and that we share this concept with families. In a moment, I'm going to share some books and resources on the next slide. Before I get to all of those resources, I want to tell you about some of the techniques that are included in those resources. These are techniques by Dr. Boss in her books. The first one I want to briefly tell you about is this practice of both and thinking, which entails care partners holding contradictory thoughts in their minds. Dr. Boss's example includes that their loved one with dementia is both alive and dead. And another way to look at it is that the person living with dementia is both still a spouse, but is also a child at the same time. Another coping mechanism is this idea of managing this mixed emotions that can accompany dementia caregiving. For example, a care partner reflecting on how life might be easier when they're no longer caregiving, only to be hit a moment later with an intense guilt for thinking about that relief in the future. And then there's actual relief that can cause guilt. Going to do something for themselves, going out with friends, taking a break outside the home, these things bring immense guilt, and it's important that we manage these emotions. The final technique that I want to highlight is to balance control and acceptance. And I summarized this with a quote from Dr. Boss from her book, where she writes, deciding to accept a situation is not the same as passively surrendering to it. And now, of course, we have COVID-19 that we've all been struggling with for so long. This adds yet another layer of ambiguous loss with the many unrecognizable losses that continue to add up, as well as the ambiguity and overload of information. This is a growing area of research within ambiguous loss that I encourage you to follow with Google Scholar Alerts. There's so much more that I want to tell you about ambiguous loss, and I hope that I've at least piqued your interest to follow up on some of these resources. The first one is a 2012 book by Dr. Boss called Loving Someone Who Has Dementia, How to Find Hope While Coping with Stress and Grief. This is something I recommend to caregivers as well as practitioners, because this is a really good basic understanding, great explanation of this concept. This is a book that through our GWET program we have in Louisiana that we recommend, and we actually provide for many caregivers. So please check that book out. And then there's a book before that by Dr. Boss, which is aimed more towards us as practitioners. It's called Loss, trauma and resilience, and it goes a lot behind the theory of everything. So especially if you're a professional and you want to be able to help them work through some of these things and know the background of these coping techniques, I highly recommend that. Then there's also ambiguousloss.com. It's a website run by Dr. Boss and her team. And from this website, she and the University of Minnesota offer online modules that are recorded that I highly recommend. But please note that there's a financial investment for this particular training with CEUs. I recommend referring caregivers to a great program called the Finding Meaning and Hope video discussion series. I have a website listed here, duetkz.org. Duet Partners in Health is a nonprofit in Arizona, and they partnered with Dr. Boss and a benefactor to produce a series of videos that are just very well done, that you can actually, folks on the call here, can also become trained facilitators for this video series at no charge, and you can even do it online, as I and a colleague here at Oxnard have done that. So that's Finding Meaning and Hope video discussion series. Not quite a book club, not a support group, but a video discussion group that's very well done. And then, of course, to recognize the additional ambiguous losses that COVID has presented. And now I turn it over to Anna Shay, our caregiver, to share her own experience and insights that only she can. Anna Shay?
Ambiguous loss. I'm sorry?
We couldn't hear you. I just wanted to make sure you knew that your sound wasn't working quite yet, but now we can hear you.
I apologize. My phone lagged for a second. Ambiguous loss, as Matt has illustrated to us, is deep and complex, multifaceted, and often not addressed. Experiences of isolation and loneliness are fairly common parts of ambiguous loss that can become major drivers that create more loss for caregivers. I'm addressing this because I am a caregiver that has experienced this firsthand and also spent a lot of hours with other caregivers going through this experience with them. However, the reason that I'm here instead of someone else is that I've actually created the exact opposite experience of most caregivers. I haven't lost anything long-term. I actually gained. I created an even larger community of friends and acquaintances through caregiving, even as my family drifted away. I engage in social activities and even perform regularly in dance troupes for all kinds of events, including Mardi Gras. I do charity work, I started up my own business, and I managed to date and then get married, all as a caregiver. I am an exception, and I shouldn't be. So let's get down to it. It's important to note that caregivers don't usually think that isolation and loneliness are necessarily separate things because they often feed into each other. Loneliness can absolutely be alleviated through addressing isolation, but it also can be very individualized and more complicated emotions. And so in this presentation, I'll be focusing on isolation because it can speak to broader action in communities. Isolation is the withdrawal from community or networks that they had prior to diagnosis or becoming caregivers. It's usually not a single large decision. It's death by 1,000 cuts, so to speak. And loneliness is something that someone can experience even if they're in a crowd of thousands, and this is well documented. Knowing which of these things you're addressing with your community of caregivers or the individual caregiver makes a world of difference because isolation is not a viable long-term solution to living for a caregiver. The hard truth of caregiving is that you're going to survive the disease that your person has. And you need to have something to survive for, both every day and after they're gone. A lot of caregivers choose to isolate for a number of reasons, which I'll be going over, but there's also a self-perpetuating cycle of loneliness and isolation that is created because we've lost a lot of the rituals of community that used to surround caring for someone with a chronic condition. Lacking in rich networks of community is an overall driver of both loneliness and isolation, and it must be addressed.
So there's a multitude of reasons why we have to address isolation in caregivers, but perhaps the most dire is the amount of caregivers that die from the effects of isolation. Almost a fifth of us die before the people that we care for, and that's a pretty significant number. When we're isolated, it significantly impacts our mental, emotional, and physical health. And this has been compounded by the pandemic, of course, but these issues persisted for decades before now. These numbers are the latest that we have on caregiver death and functional decline, and they are pre-pandemic. Isolation takes away from the caregiver's ability to step outside of their caregiving role and find relief. In a journal editorial by Dr. Cara M. Ross and Dr. Judith E. Carroll, they note specifically that caregiving can be socially isolating, and many caregivers find it difficult to effectively ask for help from their social support networks, and that caregivers who could engage in leisure activities outside of caregiving, which requires community help at some level, had better health outcomes, notably and lower blood pressure in the long term. I have a personal story that I have the permission to share of a woman who is in one of the state-based groups that I'm in, and I want to warn you right now that this is kind of a heavy story that speaks to this. She was a very isolated caregiver that lived in a small town. She's a young widow with children. She works, and she also takes care of her mother with Alzheimer's who has other issues. This caregiver is also a diabetic, and she found herself in the position of having to make the choice between getting her mother's medication or getting her own. And she chose getting her mother's meds and decided that she would just do everything she could to control her diabetes without insulin. 5 days later, her blood sugar was well over 400, and she had been in a danger zone for some time, and she was still 2 days away from her next payday. She didn't call for an ambulance because she couldn't afford it if she did, and she was honestly fairly sure that this was it for her. She was done. And she got on our group on a Facebook Live hoping that someone else would be on just so she wouldn't be alone when she died. I'm sorry, this still kind of works me up. Of course, when one of us figured out what was going on, we all sprung into action. We never really talked about the towns we were in, but we figured out where she was. We called a local pharmacy and paid for her insulin for weeks out, and another caregiver got an ambulance out to her and had access to a community fund that could help her pay for it. We actually didn't know for 2 days whether or not she made it because she ended up being hospitalized. She was resigned to dying, like she just accepted this was going to happen, but she didn't want to die like she had been living, which was alone. And the fact that she had us, even though we were all really just strangers on the internet, is what saved her life. This is a more extreme case, of course, but it's not uncommon that no one realizes how dire the situation is for a caregiver until something goes very sideways like this. And I honestly don't know that her neighbors or her family members outside of her house ever knew that this happened. Isolation and its great risks largely go unnoticed by most, and it's not because people are malicious or thoughtless. We're frankly just not socialized anymore in such a way that we know how to show up for people who are going through chronic illnesses or in a perpetually vexing stage of life. As a society, we do not have a holistic approach to life and instead focus on youth, and we find aging and the entire process of dying to be really uncomfortable. It's really easy to blame Hollywood for the fascination of youth, and that's not incorrect, but market forces have also contributed to this in part. The rise of the funeral industry and the medical industries at the same time took large chunks of both chronic illness and dying processes out of our homes, and rightfully so in very many cases. But it disrupted a lot of long-standing traditions of community reliance, and so now death is treated more like an event in a lot of communities, and aging is mostly tactfully ignored. And while this is an overarching theme in the United States, it manifests in communities in different ways, many of them driven by culture. If you'd like to research more about that, I highly recommend starting with the Center for Radical Death Studies. They do enormous amounts of scholarship around aging and death rituals for BIPOC communities. If you don't know what BIPOC is, it's an acronym for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. So all of this said, where do you go from here? So here's some actions to take. Understanding the cultural and historical underpinnings of the approach to caregiving in your area is absolutely crucial, of course, to figuring out those linchpins of loneliness or isolation. And this doesn't have to do just with the community at large. And this is doubly important when working with singular caregivers. There are simple technology solutions that can help alleviate these issues, of course, and I've listed them here. The phone companion services are really great, and they fulfill needs for people that are at all kinds of level of communication and care. I have my own mom enrolled in a free service for this, and she absolutely loves it. Another point is reaching out to religious institutions to help do the work of bridging the loneliness and isolation gap is a huge step forward in many communities. Those institutions often think about doing the work but either don't know how to do it or may lack the resources. In my own research, I interview other caregivers, and well over 3/4 of them talk about how much they miss being able to go to their religious institution or have contact with those people because the person that they care for can't really function well in services, and they don't want to be a social burden or be embarrassed, that kind of thing. In rural areas, especially, churches fulfill a lot of really important functions. So finding grants available to them to do outreach or create transportation opportunities or make dementia-friendly ministry groups and services would be monumental. For those who are a little more tech-savvy, the sky is honestly the limit. I've listed out some platforms that particularly host great content when it comes to the caregiver community and life hacks and all kinds of other things that caregivers really need. I love all of them. I personally use all of them. For younger caregivers, there are some really great nonprofits out there, like the Love Labor Project, that addresses the unique position of being a young caregiver, and our Turn to Care that specifically caters to BIPOC and LGBTQIA community caregivers, in addition to the ones that are well established. There are tons of Facebook groups, of course, and the best thing about them is that there's always somebody awake to talk to or get tips or commiserate, whatever you need. And finally on this slide, the hard work of crafting out the language for calls to community. This is a particularly sensitive point that I divided up into 2 separate bullets because there are 2 distinct messages. The first is how to get the community at large involved in supporting their local aging and dementia population. And the second is how a person's individual social network can show up for them. The steps for each group are different and have very separate timelines. And one of the things that you can do with caregivers as professionals is help them make a list of tasks that can be done by anyone. These tasks need to be close-ended and have a general low barrier of investment, or they need to be single projects. For example, I know a caregiver that got her Bible study group to come help her clean out her mother's overly stuffed garage. And personally, I've actually created an entire community of people around doing like these small things that help me support my mother's care. And I have amazing friends who show up for me. They've done everything from helping me with providing breakfast for my mom after I was in a head-on collision to dropping off items to me that I couldn't go get because I couldn't leave my mother. It's really important to look at creating these community functions because support groups, which are go-to community vehicles for professionals, have different functions in our lives than social networks. So support groups and social networks are equally important in offering avenues out of isolation, and they may look similar, but they're not the same thing and usually don't even involve the same people. Within caregiver support groups, we find relief in that we know what we say is being heard how we mean it. Especially in English-speaking communities, we don't really have good vocabulary for expressing the depth or breadth of a lot of the emotions that we experienced. Saying that you're sad to someone who is also in the middle of a similar situation just frankly hits differently than saying it to someone who has never done this work, and that's including professionals who haven't been caregivers. When we talk amongst ourselves without professional moderating, we even have our own terminology that we use and preferences for how we're addressed. We change our language to fit whatever the professional likes to use, of course, but we guard our words differently because we don't want to offend or cause problems. An innocuous example of this is that we use LOWD, or LOUD, as an acronym for loved one with dementia, and we use the term LO for loved one. And in my research, I found that we prefer to be called caregivers because care partners, which is the preferred language of professionals, has distinct connotations regarding power structures and the proximity of intimacy. In short, when you say care partner, we often think of someone who doesn't live with the person who has dementia, gets paid for the work, and is probably a medical professional. We get a lot of solace from not having to work as hard to convey what our state of being and living is like, and also a little bit from the Schadenfreude because we all walk away from at least one group thinking, well, at least I'm not them. Also important is that we very intentionally seek out these interactions, and they have limited time frame of applicability in our lives. When our person is gone, we often don't come back to our support groups. Social networks, though, exist before diagnosis and the assumption of caregiver roles, and hopefully exist during and afterwards, too. They fulfill the need for connection to something broader than caregiving, and we get a lot of soft strengthening from them. We get to forget, or at least not focus so intently on caregiving and disease through our social networks, and often we can derive a sense of self-efficacy through watching other people doing equally challenging things that are different from what we're doing, or from doing something with our group that we've never done before. There's a lot of safety valves built into social networks that aren't available in support groups, such as their ability to adapt to our needs quickly and the fact that they can be activated at any time. Whereas, of course, a support group is only available during certain times. Perhaps the most important difference is that social networks, if they can be established or maintained, will actually outlast the caregiver phase of life and go into the phase of survivorship. And survivorship is a phase of an undetermined amount of time that follows the death of our loved one with dementia. And it's often a really weird time in our lives that people in our caregiver support groups haven't gone through yet. So these are some actions that you can take to help caregivers create those inroads for support groups or social networks. I mentioned a few of them in the prior action slide, so I won't go over those again. But what I would like to focus on is the creation and collaboration with other nonprofits that provide caregiver support groups. And I want to talk about this because so often in dementia, we find ourselves trying to reinvent the wheel. This applies especially to caregivers, but also to the professionals that are supporting those caregivers and those who have dementia. You don't necessarily have to create a brand new caregiver support groups. Direct caregivers to support groups that already exist and that could speak to their experience instead. This is a pretty low-cost way of supporting them. Doing something as small as doing an introductory email between a caregiver and a facilitator of a group, or going to visit other groups and just creating lists of possibilities for them is huge, because the one thing that caregivers don't have a lot of is time. The other thing to focus on here is encouraging caregivers to be within their communities and act as leaders and educators. It's extraordinarily empowering to us to be able to contribute to someone other than our loved one with dementia. When I was first put out the call that I wanted to interview other caregivers because I was writing a paper on the lived caregiver clinical experience, I was honestly overwhelmed with people who just wanted to contribute and tell me their stories just so that maybe they could help make a world that was a better place for caregivers to come, if not for themselves. So if all these opportunities are available, why would we ever consider isolating ourselves? This is the short list and the 50,000-foot view, as I like to call it, and I'm going to give you all a moment to look at these and then kind of move on into talking about these things in groups. So older caregivers have such a different set of challenges than those who are younger, and it's not just related to declines in function or technological barriers, although both of these things are considerable. A lot of their challenges are set by social standards. They come from a generation where men relied heavily on women to do the work of communication and fostering relationships, for example. So when their wives are no longer able to do that for them, they kind of just drift away. They also get embarrassed because they feel out of their depth and they're duty bound to do all the things and be the hero husband. Conversely, older women actually find themselves in the position of not really feeling welcome in their old friendship circles because those circles are made up of married units. And because their husband isn't present in the same way that others are, There's an unspoken push to go be friends with widows or women who have chosen to stay single. Younger caregivers have a different kind of grief and shame because we watch other people making those achievements that we were supposed to be making, and we often feel like we can't make them in the future. It's so hard for us to watch other people have good jobs and pay off their debts and buy houses, get married, have children, go on vacations, and even just have the chance to do hobbies. So we withdraw. We don't have anything in common, we don't think, and we don't feel like what we're doing has the same kind of merit as what they're doing, and we feel like failures. There's also a cultural expectation that we just kind of go away if we're caregiving, and it's a corollary to the way we talk about people with dementia vanishing. This is a deeply philosophical conversation as well as a linguistic one, but we often feel pressure to disappear because we have different constraints and our loved ones with dementia live by a different set of rules than other people do. We also think we have to protect the dignity of their memories, and we'll often go out of our way to do so, including withdrawing because things like Daddy would be embarrassed if he knew how dependent he'd become. Spoiler alert, he does know. Or Mama wouldn't want anyone to see this. Additionally, we feel called to be superhumans or saints. It's terribly toxic, and it's something that we not only tell ourselves, but society consistently reinforces. We are supposed to be compassionate always. We are never supposed to say no, and there's all these other ridiculous and oversimplified rules without any education on the mechanisms that makes those rules of becoming a quote-unquote good caregiver even slightly obtainable. Love only qualifies you so far to do this work, and then you have to step back. This is a particular pet peeve of mine, this call to be saintly, because I've watched so many caregivers castigate themselves for not being good enough based on caregiver guidelines that someone gave them. And honestly, I wrestled with this too for a really long time. I'm on my 6th year of caregiving, and I spent the first 4 in a state of anxiety because I wasn't good enough. Another caregiver I know actually had a complete nervous breakdown because of the toxicity of expectations that she had been told she had to fulfill. She is a sandwich caregiver, which means that she's taking care of people older than her and people younger than her. And not only did her family not really help her, but they also told her that she wasn't doing the right things or doing enough, and some healthcare professionals said the same thing to her, and it just eventually broke her. She spent months in bed, unable to do anything, and we're breaking caregivers with these expectations and pushing them to withdraw from us, and we have to stop. So what do we do instead of what has been the common approach? A lot of these overlap into other points of action, so I'm going to focus on the unique points. Finding assistive tech in different price brackets that can help shore up areas that a person is struggling in functionally is huge. Contact home organizers. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but good home organizers know all about kinds of systems and gadgets and can accommodate all kinds of people and spaces. The list method is something that is particular to me, and I won't go heavily into detail here because it could take up an entire presentation's worth of time. But it's a technique I came up with for myself to manage all the duties of being a caregiver, and it can be used to help create those community inroads that I've been talking about. The basics of it is that you make a list of every single thing that you do every day for a week, and you also list all the things that you do that aren't on that list initially. At the end of the week, you take your daily list and you figure out what you can automate, delegate, or eliminate. And that is one way you can streamline your tasks and create more space in your calendar for doing other things, such as, relaxing or maintaining social networks. I actually have a guide to this on my blog, and I can answer more questions about this, but that's generally how it works. Moving on to another part of isolation that's less society-based and more experience-based is isolation for the preservation of self and the person that we care for. A dementia diagnosis affects people in a lot of different ways, and sometimes friends and family handle it really poorly and become untrustworthy. We all know these stories, the siblings that show up and clean out the parent's house on the fly, the family members that are angry and don't know how to deal with it and lash out, those kinds of things. As caregivers, we get put in a spot where we have to protect our own mental and emotional health and cannot do the heavy lifting at all of placating other people, so we isolate. And then we often have predatory issues where scammers realize that they're dealing with an old person with cognitive issues, or even family members that do it. We pull away from those people on purpose because it's a safety issue. And in that case, as professionals, it's even more important to help them create a safe community for them, because a truly isolated caregiver and person with dementia is easy pickings for these people. So this is one of those things that can be kind of complicated because you're dealing with literal safety. If the caregiver thinks that maybe a good relationship can be made and they want to put forth that work, then helping them come up with ways to frame the conversation to come to an understanding is a good idea. It's optimal if you actually have a neutral space for them to meet, because public is safer. I would say that playing it on the defense is a better course of action. Create lists of professionals that can help them outside of the medical community. We need to know about attorneys and financial advisors that specialize in working with the elderly anyway, but there's a new urgency when we're worried about keeping our people safe. Publish options for family counseling, and if you can, provide a rent-free space, such as an unused room that you can put tables, chairs, and snacks and stuff like that for them to get together and talk, or possibly be counseled. If you can take the extra initiative to host presenters from those professional groups that I mentioned before, that would be amazing. And also have the police and EMS offer classes to caregivers on safety and emergency first aid. Some areas do these things already. There's a few organizations in Michigan that host attorneys and financial planner presentations to help caregivers that come to mind, but we need more of this more often. So as you can see, we face a lot of issues as caregivers. The deck is pretty stacked against us in a lot of ways, but for caregivers who come from already marginalized communities or minority communities, it's even harder. I could spend an entire day talking about caregiving in marginalized community, but we don't have that kind of time. So I'm just going to hit a few points just for thought. The first is that 9 to 11%, depending on which study you're reading, of caregivers are from the LGBTQIA community, and 44% of them believe that if healthcare providers knew that status, that it would adversely affect the care they receive. Also within that community, they are twice as likely as any other group to be isolated. African Americans face incredible amounts of burden. Over half of them are sandwich caregivers, meaning that they're taking care of someone who is their senior and at least one person who is a minor. And on top of that, 66% of African American caregivers are also working full or part-time jobs. Hispanic communities have the highest prevalence of caregivers at over 20% of Hispanic identifying people being caregivers and spending an average of 30 hours a week doing caregiver tasks. Indigenous populations are often not mentioned at all or represented in caregiver support work outside of their nations. They're doing some really great work in Washington State with local nations, but by and large, they're kind of invisible. And the last community that I'm going to highlight here is the deaf community. Now, the deaf community is exceptionally strong and resilient and incredibly adept and successful at taking care of their own community. But oftentimes when deaf people develop dementia, they end up in facilities and isolated where no one knows their language. They're doing some pretty significant research in the UK on dementia in this community, but within the United States, there's not really a lot public-facing that's happening. There's only really one person who is doing work in this area, and it's Mary Jane Grant, and she is a CODA, and she has YouTube videos. So what do you do for these folks? As healthcare or social work professionals, one of the things you can do is push for materials suitable for different communities and reach into these communities and get caregivers to come, ask them if they would be willing to help you create those materials. It's really important that you include anybody that you're trying to create things for in the creation process. Visibility matters a lot. Do research and become familiar with the literature available for specific groups. For example, there's maybe four books available that speak to the uniqueness of the African American caregiver experience. One of them is actually for social workers, and it is a different experience. You need to validate them and make space for them, and by making space, that means you do a lot of work of making sure no one tells them that their experience or perspective is less than someone else's, and acknowledge the differences and try to find ways to create equity for them. Often BIPOC communities really struggle with the fact that as individuals, they're often treated as a racial representative, and this is really true, it's especially true in caregiving. Another thing that you can do is become familiar with your local interpreters. There are a lot of people with dementia whose first language is not English. Dementia is, in essence, a disease of communication, and you don't process the inputs to create good outputs for the world around you. Compound that problem with somebody speaking to you in a language that you aren't sure of anymore, and it just makes things really hard. It's also especially hard for caregivers who struggle with English to get the support they need. So it's really important that you bring in interpreters, because not only can they do the communication, but they can also help you with cultural brokerage. And then finally, we have the cherry on top, which is COVID. COVID has created a lot of social disaster and burdens for everyone, but perhaps no one more so than for caregivers. Of course, this is really new, so we don't have a ton of data available to us on the effects, but here's what we do know. Caregivers are working longer, harder, and have lost more resources, including their money and jobs, than ever. Our isolation incentives are greater because we're trying to keep our loved ones with dementia alive, and we don't often feel comfortable with outsiders coming in, which means that if we had help before, we've reduced it. And because we're having to isolate and do more work, we're communicating outside of that tiny world even less, and our health is suffering immensely. So there's no easy answers here, but many of the points of action that I've talked about before are applicable to overcoming COVID-driven isolation. Additionally, responses are going to be really regionally driven, so I can't necessarily speak well to that. It's a huge emerging issue, and I'm sure that we're going to have more good information coming in the future. So we've covered an enormous amount of really heavy points and a really heavy topic. And I just want to say that I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have done so with you today. 6 years ago, when I became my mother's sole caregiver, I was very alone, I was really depressed, and I had zero guidance. What I did have were 3 friends who loved me and helped me as much as I could. And one night I said to them that this doesn't have to be this hard. And if I can help someone else not suffer like this, that's what I want to do. So I want to thank you for your time today and allowing me the space to live that mission with you. And I'm going to hand it over to Matt to finish this up.
Thank you, Shay. I really admire everything that you do for your mom, and you found time on this journey, on this challenging journey, to really be a voice for those who are living with dementia and their care partners. So thank you for everything that you said. So as Shay said, we covered a lot of material. So why does this matter? After this, we're gonna open it up for questions. So please, if you have something, put that in the chat. So as professionals, from our perspective, why does this matter? Well, this is an opportunity to heal families. And as you know, we don't have a cure for any of the dementia types, but we can still heal in a sense. And this is whether we're social workers, we're physicians, project directors, or other professionals. If you're on this call, it's very likely that your scope will touch this in families in some way. With more community, we can reduce systemic stressors. And if we can integrate this concept of isolation, ambiguous loss, everything that we talked about today, little by little, of course, we will empower not just the families that we're meeting with each day, but also the generations that come after them. We're really setting up an infrastructure for a lasting impression. And then finally, from the caregiver perspective, from Anna Shay's perspective, our work here as professionals, we can increase how effective that the caregivers and care partners are. This allows caregivers to be on a true team where people are together, we're on the same page, a true team of professionals and caregivers and care partners, which can elevate the quality of care, life opportunities, and also improve quality of life for all that are involved. And finally, with this, we can reduce the amount of dangers, of which there are many on this journey that Anna Shay covered. So here I'm going to show you this slide with our contact information. Please reach out to us if we're not able to answer a question here or just to follow up with more information. We would love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt and Anna Shay, for your great presentations. We have some time to talk about to answer some questions. So as your questions come to you, please enter those in the question and answer pod. And we'll get started because some have already come in. So I want to talk a little bit about how we might be able to guide some of the professionals who work in the community to assist caregivers in their role caring for people living with dementia. So can both of you talk a little bit about what you think is the number one thing community providers can do or should ask of caregivers who are engaging in their services? What's kind of like the number one, maybe even 2 and 3 things that they should ask or do based on your experience and the work that you've done? Matt, do you want to start?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, great question. So I think number one, we need to put aside our assumptions and listen to their story, the whole thing, and be very empathetic and just make sure that we're understanding all the circumstances around the condition, not just the physical things going on, the physical, the mental, intellectual things, but what's surrounding that, because I think a lot of times we're not considering that, and that has a huge impact on the work that we do, whether it's physical, social, emotional. And another is with that information, I think that's really going to inform steps 2 and 3. And again, not having assumptions, but so after we hear their story, ask them what they're looking for instead of assuming that we're going to come in and fix their issues. So I'll stop right there because I want to make sure Anna Shay has a moment to cover that as well.
Thanks, but actually you did a really good job of covering like what your first step is. Within my own research, I can tell you that caregivers are often just completely ignored by different professionals, and they focus just on the person that we're taking care of. And oftentimes, like, just taking that time to get a full scope of what their landscape looks like makes an incredible difference. And it also makes us more likely to keep engaging and elevating our situations and making things better.
Great, thank you so much. So another question that came in was asking about a few things about how those who are working in the community to serve caregivers and people living with dementia can encourage caregivers to seek services and supports. You know, a lot of people feel like I should be able to do this on my own. You know, I shouldn't need help. This shouldn't be so hard. So what kinds of things can you suggest that professionals in the community can do to encourage the use of services and supports? Anna Shay, do you want to start this one and then pass it off to Matt?
Sure. So yeah, actually, we often feel like we should be like superhumans and that we should have all the things, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. One of the things that really helps is doing like what I said when I was talking about collaborating with other nonprofits and institutions that provide different kinds of caregiver support groups. So like, you know, people like, because when you're talking to your own cohort, you often feel more comfortable. And then the other thing that you can do is actually just like have a folder ready for new caregivers where it tells them all these tips and tricks and life hacks, because if you open the door that way, they're going to keep coming back to you as problems arise, and you can keep either directing them to more life hacks and resources, or you can be like, I know somebody who actually has dealt with this before. Do you want to connect with them? And then and through those single actions, you can bring them in and let them know about the services available to them. And just, you know, you have to, sometimes it's a slow burn, but those kinds of things get people on board really fast, because we have a huge learning curve as caregivers, and we don't necessarily feel our need for community or like services in a real sense. We just urgently need to get these tasks done. So start there, meet them where they are, and then gradually pull them into the other services. And then I'll pass it off to Matt.
Yeah, something that comes to mind here is, and Shay mentioned cohorts, is really utilizing the unique communities, diverse communities, to address it along with professionals, but also within their community. So, for example, we've seen that Vietnamese American families, they look at dementia as a source of shame, and that I can see how that makes it very difficult for even the greatest provider to be able to reach them and speak with them when they don't want to recognize it themselves. So I would tap into those community leaders, the faith-based leaders, to see how you can build trust, because that will take some time, but to be patient and build trust with that leader, with the community, in hopes that will sort of create a bridge to them.
Great, thank you so much. So we are running out of time. We have a lot of great questions that we weren't able to get to. I encourage you all who had questions that weren't answered to reach out to our speakers to ask if there's a few resource questions and things like that. That would be good to get answered individually via email. But I want to take just a minute to thank you both again, Matt Estrad and Anna Shay Edwards, for your great presentations today and the information you shared with our participants. Thank you to all of you who participated for the National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center webinar series. We hope you'll join us again for our next webinar on September 14th, where we'll talk about community-based dementia programs, learning from challenges and sustaining successes. Registration information is available on the ASA website. At this time, I will turn it back to Leanne Clark-Shirley for some final remarks.
Thank you, and on behalf of ASA, thanks to the presenters and everyone for attending. It was a great talk. If you'd like to claim CEUs for the webinar today, you'll get a follow-up email by the end of today, and that email will contain a link to the CEU application. That follow-up email will also contain a link to today's slides. Please note that you have 60 days to claim continuing education units for today's webinar, and remember that it'll take about 30 days from the date of your submission in order for us to process and issue your CEUs. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you at the next NARDC webinar. Take care.